we always have to have set an expectation. Otherwise, what is the feedback about? And that's very much the case when it comes to that longer term feedback, like a performance review. Because if someone really didn't know what they were supposed to be delivering on, it does feel like a subjective conversation. Even if you, the manager, feel like, well, this stuff is like obvious, it's basic, of course it's part of the job. But if it's not totally spelled out, it doesn't always land that way.
Welcome to the People Managing People podcast. We're on a mission to build a better world of work and to help you create happy, healthy, and productive workplaces. I'm your host, David Rice. My guest today is Lia Garvin. She is the author of a new book called The New Manager Playbook, a simple guide for leading with ease, and the host of the Managing Made Simple podcast. We're going to be digging into the book a bit and talking about what keeps new managers from driving the results they hope for. Lia, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. So happy to be here.
Absolutely. All right. Well, I want to start with a question about the sort of times that we're living in, if it's not too heavy. This is the era of unbossing at the moment that we're sort of hearing about, so to speak. Traditional hierarchies are changing fast, though. You've got a lot of talk around flattening org structures, et cetera. How do you think management evolves over the next 5 years?
Yeah. I mean, I think right now there's a lot of talk around abolishing middle management. Middle managers are the problem. I think we probably are both laughing a little bit because I think the problem is not the problem today. I don't think is that we have middle managers. I think it's that we have people in leadership roles who have had no training, or maybe they don't even want to do that because the system in many corporate environments, especially, like you have to amass people under you to get promoted and to grow up the ranks. So I think what I foresee over the next few years is less layers in companies. But my hope is it's done really thoughtfully around, well, okay, the more layers you remove, you have to have more communication and coordination, right? Because you have more kind of one-to-many. And so I think through the use more of, moving some tasks to automation, I think there's a lot of value in, AI meeting note takers and things like that can kind of simplify it and create more open lines of communication. I think organizations will flatten somewhat. And my hope and mission, and probably both, is we do maintain management in the right ways because it also allows people to, be able to rise to their full potential when we utilize management the right way.
Yeah, I agree. I was thinking about this because I was appearing on somebody else's podcast and they were asking this kind of question about how it's going to change. And one of the things I think about is if we eliminate sort of the door to leadership, which oftentimes is management for people, there's going to have to be some other way to identify leaders. And I don't know what that looks like, but maybe it's sort of a rotational opportunity where people can exhibit leadership skills and take on different things. And then if they excel at it and they show certain traits and certain aptitudes, then maybe, they take on more of these type things. And then that's how they sort of just naturally move into leadership. I don't know exactly. It's an interesting time for what the hierarchy and the assessment of leadership potential might look like.
Yeah. I do think something I've actually thought for a while, especially with Gen Z, characteristically having less, valuing different things, right? It's not only promotion and achievement driven. It's more kind of purpose over purse strings or whatever. In some cases, I had felt for a long time that these traditional mechanisms for performance, around, did you get the right rating and are you getting the bonus? That's not going to work anymore. And so what are we going to have to incentivize people inside of big companies? That's a prediction I have that's we're going to have to drastically change performance structures as they stand today. What I think that we should do instead, I think we could co-write a book on that about that. But I think that's one of the major things that's going to have to change because if you're not motivated by the thing the traditional assessment is doing, then it's not going to work. It's not going to kind of keep the troops in line, right? And so I think we have to redesign that system. And I also think there's going to be a lot more kind of project-based work, instead of working in a company for life, right? You come on short term.
Yeah, and I think assessment has to change so as we get to, and if we do go more skills-based with work, right, then assessment sort of has to change. Is there just naturally an opportunity for certain skills to shine more, essentially? And then does that cloud our judgment of who has leadership potential? It's sort of a domino effect. One thing impacts the next, So you got to constantly kind of like pull back and look at the whole picture and then see where like, oh, well, because we changed this, we got to tweak this
Yeah.
kind of thing.
Yeah. It's kind of like a systems design
Yeah.
exercise, right?
Yeah. Well, all right. I was kind of moving along. I kind of think the theme of 2025 so far, at least from what we've been encountering with people managing people and the things that we get asked about, trust is one of the big things, right? How to build it, how to maintain it. We get these questions all the time. And I want to start us off with a question about trust, but it's not organizational trust we're going to talk about here. Early in the book, you established that we have to trust employees to do their jobs, right? That, as you put it, installing software to monitor keystrokes and eye movement isn't going to guarantee productivity any more than sticking a geo tracker in your kid's backpack is going to help them choose better friends, right? So pretend I'm a CEO who thinks that if people think we're watching them, essentially, they'll be more productive. Explain to me why I'm wrong.
Ugh. Well, my friend, because when people feel like they're being watched or over supervised or micromanaged, they find the edges. They want to exploit that because it's like we feel like we want to prove it to people, like we want to kind of rebel against that, right? That's why, again, when you're over monitoring your kids, they hang out with even worse friends or whatever,
Yeah.
right? Or when we say, people try to exploit the rule. And that's why I think when we get overly prescriptive, and I talk about this with all the teams that I work with, because I think when a manager or a leader feels like, oh, my team's not, they're not following through on things, they're not doing this, I'm just going to make more detailed processes and rules and handbooks. And as a, person with an operational background, I drove team operations within Google, Apple, and Microsoft. Like, it's not about more process, it's about less, making it more clear, talking about the goals, right? And so I think someone that thinks that you have to, just tighten the reins and be watching what everyone's doing, what you're going to see is all of these edge cases that you never thought of pop up overnight. This is why you're seeing people with like, when folks have to be returned to office, having someone badge in for them, right? They would have
Yeah.
just come in the
Coffee badges,
office like
right?
now I'm having, or, maybe I drive and I go in just for lunch and I get the free lunch and I leave, or I'm going a few hours, or I have some system I've designed, to like get around it. And all you're doing is having people spend their energy they would have been like productively in their job, like on thinking of a workaround, in many cases. And I think, and we're not talking about return to office specifically, but I think there's so much value to having folks in person sometimes. And I think there's a lot of value in people being able to work, also with more flexibility. It's about finding that balance. And when we don't trust our team members, when we think that we have to monitor them, it's that we don't have clear priorities. We haven't really kind of operationalized what our values are. We've made assumptions based on very limited information, or we haven't performance managed. And we have people that are not delivering. They didn't get the feedback. They don't know it. And they're still not delivering. And we're mad and think we should monitor them more closely. Like, the needing to micromanage is actually a symptom of a lot of other things that could have been figured out and that need to happen first.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And like, I don't know how many times, whether it's in history or just in life, like one of the things that I think just is pretty obvious if you pay attention is prohibition as like a method of managing something is never works. And essentially, if you think about it, monitoring, that's what you're trying to prohibit laziness or doing something that you're not supposed to be doing. But just like it didn't work in the office and people would find ways to screw around in the break room or go on walks, do all these other things that wasn't work, right? It's like the same, you're just doing the same thing. So just
If you're gonna like not care about your job, you're gonna do it wherever you're located.
yes, exactly.
Exactly.
You're gonna
And
do
I
it no
think
matter what the tech does.
exactly. Right? You're gonna get that little bird that taps on the, taps on the
Yeah.
computer.
The little thing that moves the mouse.
Exactly. And like you said, prohibition, it promotes like some sort of uprising in a different way. And I think the real issue, if it's about disengagement or people not doing enough, right, or whatever, productivity being low, which I think they're being measured in somewhat subjective ways in many cases. But I do know like engagement is low, motivation is low, and people kind of in general feel like, do I want to be here? Like the way to address it is not tracking them, more closely. It's figuring that out. And actually, I think that empowering our managers and the skills I talk about in the new Manager Playbook actually directly addresses, well, like, okay, what do we do instead? How do we re-engage our team members, and what skills does a manager need to be able to do that? Because it's hard if you haven't thought about it or haven't tried that before.
One of the things you talked about in the book that I thought was interesting was like this idea of pre and postmortems around projects as a way of
Yeah.
building psychological safety. And I think we have to consider like stand up meetings or one to ones or team
Yeah.
feedback loops as ways to do this. But I'm curious, like, what makes a good pre or postmortem, and why is that an effective way to create that sense of safety?
Yeah. I love the question. I think for both a pre or postmortem are drivers for psych safety. And I believe Amy Edmondson talks about it in the Fearless Organization. So it's one of the tools that is really widely used for psych safety specifically because it gets a lot of voices into the conversation, right? It's kind of allowing more people to be speaking. And the more people that can share the perspective, the more we're listening to each other. That does help build psych safety. But a pre-mortem specifically, which is when we talk about how a project might go before the project, that's not only a builder of psych safety, it's an accountability builder because when you talk about it beforehand, you can say, okay, what are the risks? What might go wrong? Who is on point for each of these? You can actually start assigning owners to each of these things and you reduce risk so much right out of the gate, right? And so by doing that, you also beforehand, it also is when emotions are lower. Nothing has gone wrong yet. You know what I mean? So you can
Nobody's
get really
invested
more
anything.
iterative, expansive, right? No one screwed it up, no one missed it. And so you can sort of have these no wrong idea kind of conversation. And that really, really helps also build psychological safety because you're inviting everyone to be contributing their ideas, right? Like say, hey, what's the worst thing that could happen? What's something that would never happen, but like, what if, right? And you can give many different ways people can contribute. And so, provided that you run that effectively, a management skill facilitation, and like not just have one person answering, but there's a model that I saw work really well in software teams at Google was going around and having this is for a postmortem 3 times. You talk about what went well, each person shares, what could have gone better, each person points the finger at someone else, probably. And then third was the biggest round was like, what will I do differently next time? And when I saw this in action, I was like, oh, this whole meeting was for round 3, right? So that everybody can take that responsibility. And I think hearing from each other, everyone owning that personally, that also really builds both accountability and psych safety.
That's interesting. And like the sense of closeness that you get from that, right? Like of being
Yeah.
vulnerable and like putting yourself out there in front of people, I think is super valuable. It's important though that you don't like, as a manager, one of the things I love that you talk about in the book is the way you kind of go after the idea of the family or friends dynamic that sometimes gets peddled by like inexperienced managers or HR teams, right? I think most people sort of throw up in their mouths a little bit these days when someone stands up in front of a group of whether it's a team or the company as a whole and says things like, we're a family, right? But you take that further and argue that it's toxic in a variety of ways and that a manager's job is to maintain results based relationships, just as you would if you were running a sports team and it was a sports guy. I love the analogy, right? For managers, where the line is blurred a bit, I think, is around that. So, what advice would you give for getting back to a results based relationship?
So I think one of the reasons it can be blurry, especially on the friend one, is a lot of us become managers because we were on the team. We were friends with these people and
Yeah.
now we're
Yeah. No, it
not.
happens
And it
that
gets
you were good at
awkward.
your job. That's how you got there.
Exactly. So this is a huge one. And we actually have to recognize in our own minds, like, I have a different job. My relationship with this set of people has changed. By signing up and agreeing to take that manager job, and I know sometimes it's out of our control. If we have to do it to keep the job, I understand that. But by actually moving into that job, it has fundamentally changed our relationship with our team members. And there can be some loss to that. There can be some like now you're not invited to happy hour anymore, or you're not, going to lunch with folks. There can be this, it's an identity shift. So it comes with some kind of, having to reset. But I think the first reason it can be challenging is when we were peers and we were friends, and we actually have to make that shift in our minds and reset the relationship with every team member. And I know this because I screwed it up more than once. Like when I talk about the book with 2 examples, one was I wasn't like close with this peer, but he thought I got the job he was supposed to have for manager. So that didn't go well.
Oh, yeah.
But the second time it was like my work best friend and I became her manager. And it was like by acting like, hey, it's all the same. We're still friends, all this. And then I saw that her performance wasn't delivering. And I had to, that was now my responsibility to be giving feedback on. Like that friendship was gone overnight, like whether I wanted to acknowledge it or not. And so that's where I think we really, if we already had a relationship with folks, that friend dynamic is really challenging. Now, the second one is just if we, are really in that kind of like conflict averse, we want to be peacekeeper, we really want everyone to like us and that whole thing, because you want to be like in the in group basically and not, on the outside. There we can, even if we are new to a team, we don't know folks before, I think we can fall into this like, we're all friends here. But like you said, the challenge with the friends metaphor, it's like, it's egalitarian, right? It's that, hey, we're all like, all ideas are right. We're all on the same page. And it kills psych safety because in a friend group, I think everyone's trying to keep the peace. And so it's very hard to have, even respectful disagreements. Sometimes you just kind of go with it. And then it also, a manager that's kind of struggling with some of the people pleasing and wanting people to like them, which many of us, many of us deal with.
Yeah, you're a human being. It's hard to not fall into this.
Exactly, right.
Nobody wants to be hated.
Nobody wants to be hated. And so what I argue in, the book and my podcast, which I've actually renamed it to the New Manager Playbook podcast. So it's all,
okay.
all aligned. Yeah. But I talk about that people like you better when they have clear expectations and when they see you as a leader and you're really helping them achieve their career. Like, not just because you were like the cool manager that brought some tequila in for happy hour like on Friday.
Right? Not the one that just took everybody out for beers.
Yeah.
This is interesting too, because like a key moment in your ability to connect with folks is the one-on-one. It's just a natural space to like actually get to know somebody, actually work on your communication dynamics with that person. And there's a part in the book you talk about making one-on-ones mutually beneficial, because this is important. I think that sometimes that gets lost. People sort of process it as, okay, I'm one manager talking to one employee, right?
Yeah.
But it's one-on-ones, it can be much more effective if you know when to talk, how to approach the human beings sitting next to you, and how to make it something people find valuable. So what advice do you have for new managers looking to achieve that? So it's not a one-way conversation, right?
Totally. And I think we've all been there. The one-on-one, it's just status updates. You're both bored of it, or someone, my favorite's like, hey, 5 minutes more, should we cancel? Just give each other the time back. Because
Right.
nobody wants to have this meeting. And I have had times as a manager when I dreaded the one-on-one because after about 5 minutes, there was nothing to talk about. And then I didn't know if we should shorten it or not. And the team members on the other end, like, yeah, no, everything's good. And it's just like the worst possible meeting. And you have all this other stuff to do. So like I've been there. And I think a lot of us, our instinct is, well, this is where I get informed about project status and updates. This is where we're going to talk about what's going on with just like the core work in that week. And if you're having one-on-ones weekly, it would make sense, right? You're just getting the updates and you're talking about like, yep, everything's on track. But what's missed when we talk about status reports and things like just like the status of projects in a one-on-one is you're not really getting to know that person. You're not getting under the surface. So I suggest having like a format that says, what are some of the wins and the accomplishments? What are things you're excited about? And that could be, hey, this meeting with this stakeholder that I was really nervous about, it went really well and they were really happy with the idea. It doesn't have to be like I launched a product. No, wins can be very, very small. What people are looking forward to, you can understand, what they're excited about, what they're not. So you can kind of get ahead of a motivation dip. You ask them where they're stuck, where they need support. A lot of times with our team members, if we don't ask them, they're never going to tell us where they're stuck. All of a sudden something goes wrong. And they're like, well, you were busy. I didn't want to bother you. And then we're like, well, okay. So giving it forum for them to share where they're feeling stuck. And then, saying like, hey, anything I can problem solve with you, or, even sharing feedback you're working on, right? And saying, hey, here's what, is going on with the team. Having a conversation that's like you keep the status report stuff out and it's all about, the person, the highs, the lows, the job itself. Well, this builds trust so much because you're asking them about themselves as a person. It allows you to really see how they think through problems and where they get stuck. And, I found I had a team member that this was back at Google in program management, like the currency I talk about performance reviews was having artifacts, documents, your trackers, your one pagers, your decks, all the stuff, right? And I had a team member who was like, yeah, I don't want to play that game. I'm not going to just make a bunch of stuff for no reason. And I was so lucky that we had this conversation in a one-on-one because I said, this is not yeah, it's like the whole thing at work is a game, fine. But like this having artifacts, this is how you demonstrate the value you're bringing as a program manager because your job is a lot behind the scenes. This is how you're sharing, the thought process, the strategy you brought to it, the how you're running that postmortem or whatever. And then in the course of a one-on-one, I could both explain this, share examples of ones that I had built, give her, and really reframe this whole misconception. Now, if instead I just said, like, are your projects on track? Yes, good. And I would have missed all of that, right? So this is an opportunity to really kind of excavate even where folks are getting in their own way. And that's through having these regular conversations. One more thing I'll say, I hear a lot in the workshops I run for managers is like, well, I'm in meetings with my team members all the time, right? Why would I need another one-on-one? I'm in project meetings all day. And it's because of what I just said, right? Is that it's a totally different kind of meeting, right? We're really getting to know our team member, how they work. So when you take the status report stuff out, you actually really see that it is a uniquely important meeting.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree. And like the one-on-one is it's not a performance conversation, but it has like a performance element to it, right? Now, the performance conversation, it can be tough for a new manager, right? The first time you do it is a little tense, especially if you're managing someone whose performance is, maybe not exactly where it needs to be. It almost feels a little bit confrontational in nature. And I think some people struggle with giving feedback already. But if you don't do it, it often leads to a disconnect where managers, employees have very different ideas about what's actually happening,
Yeah,
especially
exactly.
if you're not doing it in these one-on-ones. So my next question is for new managers, especially those that are new to a culture. What's the best way to prevent that disconnect and maintain that, I guess, candor, really,
Yeah. With feedback, performance reviews, or any any of it. Yeah. I mean, I would say you want to get to know your team members. Like, what is their motivator? Where are they going? Right. When we get to understand through one-on-ones and career conversations, we actually get to know what they want to do long term, what kinds of work they like to do, what they're excited about. So that, this starts to not only build trust, it helps us delegate projects. It helps us be able to give feedback in a way that they're going to really be able to receive that and action it. And so I think when we're joining a team, the first thing we have to do before approaching the performance review or kind of starting to give feedback is start by setting expectations, right? And saying like, okay, hey, what with around the work, but also understanding in our mind what this person's expectation is of themselves. Before we give any feedback, we always have to have set an expectation. Otherwise, what is the feedback about? And that's very much the case when it comes to that longer term feedback, like a performance review. Because if someone really didn't know what they were supposed to be delivering on, it does feel like a subjective conversation. Even if you, the manager, feel like, well, this stuff is like obvious, it's basic, of course, it's part of the job. But if it's not totally spelled out, it doesn't always land that way. So I always say to folks when they say my team member's not delivering and they're not doing this, not doing that, I say, okay, well, what feedback have you given them? And a lot of times, like, well, I didn't really say anything. Like, okay, so like, let's start there. But a
Oh,
lot of times, or I'm like, well, what expectation did you set? That's the real step one. And if it's like, well, this is what they were hired to do, well, then that's an opportunity in onboarding. How do we do things at this company and in this role? Or if they, you mentioned the dynamics of work has changed. So like if it's that they got it done, but like they were difficult to work with, or they were really kind of doing everything last minute, sort of talking about some of the behavioral qualities that are the expectation of the team. And so that's the stuff that you really need to do first when you're going to give feedback or then put it in a performance review. Because if the person doesn't know the expectation, they're of course going to feel defensive about it. And of course they're going to feel like it's just an opinion or it's subjective or it's like your way, you like your way better, So I think we can really disarm these situations and reduce a lot of our own fear and anxiety around giving feedback and around having a performance conversation where there's some stuff, like you said, we're kind of correcting or giving constructive feedback on when we've grounded it to something that they're like, yeah, like I understand it's hard to hear, but I do understand that that was what I was supposed to be doing or what you had set up as the expectation.
yeah, absolutely. So a little bit later in the book, you talk about recognition, and it's something I think managers have to get good at, particularly during this period where there's a lot more intention to stay, right? I think retention is getting a little bit easier in the sense that people are searching for stability right now. And when you're a new manager, it's not something that you're necessarily used to doing, right? Because when you're like an individual contributor, that's not really an expectation. It doesn't come naturally to everybody, I wouldn't say. So, talk to me about what you think constitutes recognition done well and what new managers need to consider before they look to unleash the praise, so to speak.
Yeah. So I think recognition done well, it's simple. It's specific and actionable, just like constructive feedback, right? We use the exact same tools. So I love situation behavior impact. Yes, that's it. Situation behavior impact as my go-to feedback framework because it makes us be specific, right? In the meeting, situation behavior, you had a very clear agenda and we were able to get through everything and make a decision. And the impact of that is that we made that decision and we can get back on track with our project timeline, right? That was awesome. Please do that again. So when we give specific and actionable recognition, not only do we reinforce behaviors that we want to see more of, but that person really feels seen. When we say, good job, it's like, for being alive, like for showing up today, what do you mean? Or like, great work, like, thank you, but like, I don't know exactly what you mean by that. So when we're specific, it makes it feel more genuine. That's the really go-to with that. And I think, but before we unleash it, like you said, it doesn't just mean like saying it all the time about nothing specific and concrete. And we want to understand, I think one challenge managers can have is that, well, how am I supposed to know when there's a win or something went well? Or how do I keep track of all that? This was something that I heard a lot of managers struggle with. Is like, I don't really know what all my team members are working on. Even if you have Asana or ClickUp or whatever system you're using, like, it's agreeing about like, what are the big moments? And so I actually created a resource, and I'll share with it here, this simple template where you ask folks to share what their focus is for the week, what are some of the wins that they landed, and then what are the places they're stuck, right? This is like the one-on-one agenda. Because when folks are adding to that on a weekly basis, now you have a whole catalog of accomplishments and wins that you can be talking through in the one-on-ones. You can be sharing with your executives to help that person get more reach. When you go back to write the performance review, you have all of that logged. And it's a really great way to capture that. And so that's available to folks at liagarvin.com/snippets. It's called snippets deliberately because if you ask them to fill out a status report, they're not going to do it. They're going to think you're tracking their work too tightly. And it's just something simple, right? And I encourage folks to have each team member have a rolling doc of snippets where they add it every Friday at the end of the week. You can celebrate these wins. And the way you frame that with your team member of why they're filling this out is like, hey, I want to be able to recognize, when something happens. I want to be able to share that with our VP or whoever. I want to know that you're not spread too thin or focused on stuff that someone else is focused on, right? And also be able to support you when you're stuck. So this snippets tool is like my most game-changing favorite tool. So grab it at liagarvin.com/snippets. And it's really powerful for recognition because you're getting your team members in the habit of sharing their wins.
Oh, that's perfect. And yeah, like, I mean, especially now when people are after, say, like reductions in force, and you've got managers where the team of managers that they were working with has been slashed. Now they're managing 2, sometimes 3 times as many people as they were before. How are you going to keep track of all that? You know what I
Exactly.
mean?
Right, exactly. And that's why making sure folks are focused on the right stuff every week. I think a lot of us, especially when we're new at managing, when we're nervous or anxious, we grab tighter control. And then we're like, I have to be in every meeting and every single thing. And another thing I talk a lot about in the book is their struggles with delegating. Because, and I'll tell you, that's from day one as a manager to like 50 years as a manager. Like I've seen people struggle delegating at any level. So it's not unique to new. But I think this feeling of like, I'm overloaded in meetings, I don't have any time. And this whole thing that we all feel right now is actually just because we're not delegating enough. What else could it be? Obviously, it's obviously that we maybe don't have people to delegate it to. Even as a mom, right? I have a 6-year-old. Like when I feel overwhelmed, it's like, I would love to be able to have other people doing many of these tasks, right? Like someone doing drop off from childcare, right? But it's like, I think this is really our time. We can get more time back by delegating. And as a manager, you have a team, you have a whole bunch of people that can take some of that off your plate.
Yeah, well, I like that you got into the myths of delegation in the book, like, because delegation is one of those things that it's tough when you come out as a new manager and you want to like shine and you want to prove yourself, right? But it's one of those things that you get better as you go and you kind of let go of that urge. And you realize that like people will still respect you, and know that you're there, even though you have delegated a lot of stuff, right? The manager work, I mean, it comes thick and fast anyways. If you're not drowning, I mean, you're a lucky manager.
Yeah.
This is
You're an
why-
unusual one.
Yeah,
Not,
you're an
yeah,
unusual one in this workforce, right? The psychological hurdles, though, that are attached to delegation, and they're tough to overcome.
exactly. And I think I actually had an episode on my podcast, the New Manager Playbook podcast last week, that was like delegating. A fear of delegating is really a trust issue. It's because, right, we don't trust ourselves that I actually have I have a good sense of the work, or I know what to hand off, or I'm going to do it effectively, or I kind of just get in this intuitive zone. I only know how to do it when I'm doing it. Maybe we don't trust our team members that they're ready, right? A lot of it's like the bulk of the trust issue is like they're not ready, or they won't do it exactly how I want to do it. So, then we're not really trusting that the work product. And then with our own managers, I think a lot of us, what you said is like, I'm trying to prove my value. I'm trying to prove my worth. If I delegate this, people will look over and be like, what does she do here? Like, who's this guy? Like, and it's like, no one's thinking that. But that's where I see folks get the most worried. In my workshops for managers, I see this come up a lot when I talk about delegating. They're like horrified at the idea of it because it's like, well, then what am I supposed to do? They need me. My team wants me in the meetings. And then people are going to look at me and think, why do we have you here? And it's like, again, like, I don't really think that's typically, like, no one is really thinking about it, but that fear is that I don't have another way to prove my value than doing all this or being in these meetings. So then it's like a role clarity issue that I think is important that we're establishing with folks before we make them into a manager. Like, okay, here's really what your job consists of now.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head right there. You said, I don't have another way to prove my value. And it's what that translates to is, I don't know another way to impact the business.
Yes.
And that's a problem for managers because that's a leadership issue where that hasn't been communicated down as what is it that we expect from this role? And how is it different from what you did before? And how are you going to drive success from this seat? It's a hard thing and a lot of companies kind of leave you on your own to figure it out. And it's difficult to navigate.
Yeah, exactly.
I could talk about this stuff all day with you, but
oh, me too.
Before we go, I want to give you an opportunity to, plug anything that you want, tell people where they can connect with you, find out more about what you have going on.
Yeah. So I'd say a couple places. My website, liagarvin.com. You can find all about working with me. Grab a copy of the New Manager Playbook there or on Amazon or wherever you get books. That snippets, the template I mentioned is liagarvin.com/snippets. And then my podcast, the New Manager Playbook podcast, is a great place to get a lot of detailed information on the tips and tools of stuff we talked about today. And, the way that I support teams from companies big and small, from Fortune 500s to small business owners and founders is through workshops. I have training programs directly related to the New Manager Playbook. We do offsites, team and individual coaching, really kind of anything when it comes to building a great team and great managers is areas I support. So if you're like, yeah, I think I need a little love here. It's a struggle because we're all struggling. And then absolutely do reach out. I'd love to support.
Excellent. Well, the last thing is we have a tradition here on the podcast. Before we sign off, I give every guest a chance to ask me a question. So I'm going to turn it over to you. Ask me anything you want.
So I like to ask folks, either I'll give you an option, a quick example of your best or worst manager that had like the biggest impact on you. So not just a bad manager that sucks. You never thought about it again. But, what manager, good or bad, had the biggest impact on you?
I always like to go with the good. And the one that had the most impact on me, he was a manager I had when I worked in an organization where we were working in higher ed, and it was a difficult space to navigate. And he was like a former editor of a newspaper, and I was a former journalist. And so he was kind of teaching me how to navigate the corporate world instead of the newsroom, right? And so he was really good at that, but he was also just really good at challenging me to like see things in different ways and kind of look at an opportunity as, yeah, we could do that. Let's still do that, actually. But as part of that, we'll develop like a whole new thing. And one of the things he did was he challenged me in ways that like it got me to try new creative things that I'd never tried before, which then opened up new doors. So, like, for example, prior to that time, I had done a sports podcast with some friends, but I had never like made like a corporate podcast, and I didn't even know how I would start, right? And he was like, "Well, try it. Let's see." And then it turned out to be a thing that I did really well, and I ended up launching a bunch of other podcasts. And we also kind of realized like maybe the people management route, like the traditional manager route, wasn't the right fit for me in that org. It's not that I couldn't do it. He said to me, he's like, you can totally do it, but like, wouldn't it be better if you were like managing the process of launching new things? Wouldn't that be kind of more interesting? Because we didn't have an opening. There was no route forward for me in people management at that time. And he was like, but we need to progress your career forward. So let's try to be more creative about how we do it. And even just saying that to me was like, I felt really invested in. I felt like this person sees me and they see like my talent and my effort. And that's, when you're an employee, you're like, I like it here.
Yeah. Yeah.
That makes you want to stay. And I did until he wasn't there anymore. And then,
Yeah. I was like,
then it was kind of like, well, I'm not really seeing it as much once he wasn't there. But it was one of those things. Like, it's very enlightening when you experience that. And that's the kind of thing I took into when I started managing people. I was like, okay, let me apply that same type of thinking and logic, and how can I challenge them? And yeah,
love that.
it's been great having you on today. I really enjoyed the discussion.
Yeah. Thank you. Me too.
Well, listeners, if you haven't done so already, head on over to peoplemanagingpeople.com/subscribe. Get signed up for the newsletter. You'll get podcasts, all our latest articles and newsletter sends and everything straight to your inbox. So check that out. Check out Lia's podcast. It sounds really good. Do check out the book. I've given it a read, and it's not a difficult read by any means, and it's definitely informative and thought-provoking. So you just want to check that out. And until next time, learn how to delegate.
Yes.